This is the Object Models and MVC2 lecture. We'll cover more concepts of Visual Studio's MVC, working with objects, adding models to views, creating drop lists, using the label for and text box for objects, passing query string values using route data. We'll continue using the form collection object and the redirect to action. Okay, this is a quick preview of what we're going to create today. So we're going to have a profile index view, and we're going to have a drop list on it with a button. So that drop list is going to show 1, 2, or 3, so that we're going to simulate connecting to a database. We'll do that later in this course, but we don't have database connectivity yet in the project. So when we do this, we're going to simulate reading from a database, show those fields on the screen, allow our user to change those and save them, and then prompt that user to tell them things were saved successfully. So when I click Set ID, so this is, you'll see up at in the URL, profile is the controller, properties is the view, and the last part is the ID, which particular item are you looking for? So this is the ID. This is sort of the MVC way. So if I don't want to do anything with this stuff, I just hit home, goes back to that same profile index. So I'm going to go ahead and pick item 3. So once I look at this, maybe I want to change and say, maybe you had a little different spelling, right, of your last name. You just want to update it. When I click the button, it's going to do a submit. It's going to send all this data to the server. We're going to evaluate it, save it, and then give the user prompt the user and tell them what happened. And in this case, we're just saying data submitted successfully. So let's get started with the details. Now we're going to add a new class to our project. So right-click on the Models folder, click Add, Class. Name this class Phone Number. Click Add. So here's our basic structure of our class. We're going to add 3 properties to it. So there's a lot of different properties you could add to a phone number. Country code, extension, whether it's a cell phone or an office phone. So a phone, in its simplest form, has 3 components: an area code, a prefix, and a suffix. We could also call this, when we're creating a class, we could call this part 1, part 2, and part 3. I don't think that is as obvious as using area, prefix, and suffix. So let's add these 3 properties to our class. So again, we're making a public class, and these properties are public. So each one of them are string values. So you can put in any characters. The first one's called area code, and we're giving a default of empty string. Prefix, same thing with empty string, and suffix with empty string. We'll add more to this class as we move through this lecture. So we're going to close phone numbers. Now let's add another class. In your Models folder, right-click, Add, Class. Name this class Address. You'll get the default setup. Now I'll pause for a minute for you to think about what properties would be in an address class. Right? You can just use your own home address as an example, right? So there's always a street address. Typically, that's called address 1, or at least I do that. But what else could you have in the street address? So if this is 100 Oak Street, right? You might live in an apartment 7, or apartment 3B. So there's another property called address 2. And I'll just go ahead and add these other 3 properties. So city, state, and zip. So you have public string address 1, and we're defaulting that to an empty string, and the same thing for each one of the other properties. So they're all string values in this case, and they all get an empty string to start out with. All right, so close this tab. Now we're going to update our user class. So right now, one thing to fix right now, change all these strings to lowercase. Both lowercase string and uppercase string are classes, but I like this for consistency. So inside our user class now, we have 4 properties: first name, last name, user ID, and password. There could be dozens of other properties, right? There could be date of birth, gender, lots of different properties. So we're going to add an address to a user, right? So a user or a person could have an address. So check this out. So now we're making something called home address, which is of type address, right? That is this class, right? Here's our address class, and it's got these 5 properties. I'm going back to the User.cs. So this is creating or adding a home address object to our user class. And right now it's starting out to be null. So we're going to go ahead and add 2 more addresses. A home to address. So that could be maybe you have a house in the country or a house down south where you vacation, whatever that might be. And we're also going to have a work address, right? This could be called business address, but all 3 of those are all null by default. And we'll get to that in a minute. So we're also going to add phone numbers, right? So a user or a person could have a phone number. So now we're adding cell phone as a phone number class. I'm going to open that up. So again, here's my phone number class, and it's got 3 properties in it. We're naming this as cell phone and giving it a value of null. And we're going to add 3 other phone objects to this class. We're going to add a home phone, a work phone, and an emergency phone. So this is your personal phone. This is your cell phone. You could have a home phone as well. Most people do not anymore. You could have a work phone, and you could have even an emergency phone. So somebody to contact if you're in danger or you've been hurt. So let's save that. This is a great example of object modeling. You have a user class, and inside of that object, you have other objects. So in this case, we have an address object, a couple of those, phone number objects, a few of those inside the same user object. So properties like user and address and phone, those are all properties of a user's profile on a website. So to continue with that, we're going to add a profile controller. So right click on controllers, add controller, and click empty controller, click add, and then name this profile controller. So again, MVC sets all the basic structure up. I'm going to right click. When it originally sets this up, it doesn't set up the properties the way I like this to be. So I like these first curly brackets to be up on the same line. But for some reason, this doesn't, the beginnings of a new profile, they don't uphold the styles that I put in my stuff. So if you right click on everything, edit, go to advanced, format selection or format document. Right now I've got it all selected, so I can do selection. So now it just brings these curly braces up. I'm going to get rid of the get profile. And let's just make sure everything's working in this new profile. So right click on index, add view. I'm going to leave all the defaults and click add. Okay, so same thing as normal in this initial view. We're going to change the H2 tag to be viewbag.title, just like we've done in the past. Okay, so let's make sure this new controller and view they're working correctly. So open up the properties view, the properties tab, and click on web. Instead of weeks index as the initial page, we want to do profile index. Save that and run your project. Okay, so we are indeed in our profile controller and the index view. Okay, so let's close this out and close out the properties view. Okay, so we're going to add some functionality to this view to sort of simulate what we'll be doing when we connect to our databases behind the scenes. So this is just to get us to a new profile and be able to show an individual user with their phone numbers and their addresses. So inside the index view, if you click in the Solution Explorer, this right and left arrow, if you click that, whatever view you're on, it'll highlight that part of your Solution Explorer. It'll highlight that file. So we're in the Profile Index view, and this will look familiar. This is just adding a little style to that view. And basically, it's just the sum spacing, and we're just adding a margin bottom to it. We're going to add a p tag, and we're going to add two properties. One, and this one has just a div around it, an HTML.dropdown list. And then below it, we're going to add a button. Now, in order for us to click this button, you should remember from the previous lecture is you have to have these inside the HTML begin form structure. So I'm going to set this up, put some spacing in there. So what I'm doing is creating the general structure for the begin form, put some spaces in between, and just drag this straight inside it, right? So it should look very similar to this. Again, this is just adding a div that's adding a little spacing at the bottom of this drop list, and then we have a button. You've seen that button before. Okay, so let's talk about the drop-down list. So again, this is the helper function. So HTML.dropdownList, the first property or first parameter, is the name that this drop list is going to have once it's created. And again, remember, what is this doing? This is just creating HTML for an HTML select item. So we're giving it, the name is LSTIDs, and we're using this view data generic structure that we've used before. But in this case, we're going to give it a list of select list items. And this is just casting, this is a generic object, and we're casting that, we're making that data type a list of select list item, individual item. So we'll get into more of that. So let's go inside the profile controller, and we're going to add a new method in here. So right after the index, put a few lines in there. We're going to create a private method. Okay, so it's using a list. It's going to return a list of something. And in this case, we're going to return a list of select list items. We'll get into more of that right now. So let's put a few empty spaces here. So to start, we need a generic or empty list of, and I'm just calling them items. You could call this list items. This is just a variable in your code, so you can call it anything you want. I would stick in this case with items because that's what my code is going to show. All right, so now we're going to add to this object here. We're going to add items.add, and we're going to add a new select list item, right? Because remember, this this items is a list of individual select list item objects. And a select list item object has two properties: a text, so something that we're going to show the user, and then a value, something that's assigned to this item in the code. And typically it's an ID, but it doesn't always have to be that way. So this is first just putting in an empty drop list item, right? We're going to put the word select in the top of it. We could put required, we could put a lot of things for this one. So now we're going to add the individual items inside there. So I'm adding 1, 2, and 3. I'll show you what those are for in just a minute. So again, we're doing another items.add, and we're adding a select list item and giving it two properties. So we're going to do the same thing for 2 more items. I'm going to make this 2 and 2. Typically, you don't have, the text isn't the same as the value, but in this case it is. Okay, so now we have these items, each one of them. So we have 4 items in our, we're going to have 4 items in our drop list. We're going to have the word select, just to let them know they have to select something, and we're going to give a value of nothing. We're going to have another one that has a text of 1, and we could even do this, just so we see that these are different. Right? So this is a text that we're going to show to the user. This is the value behind the scenes. And we'll take a look at that HTML here in a few minutes. And then we're returning I'm going to tidy this up a little bit. So we're returning this object, right? Now, just to make sure you understand this getID lists is going to return a list of select list items. Well, that's what this is, right? We're return items. So what we're returning has to match what's up here in our declaration, right? So this getID lists is going to return a list of select list items, and that's what we have in here. So we've got this object of the same type. This is exactly the same type as this. So when we return it, we don't get errors. We get a success. So we're building 4 items, and then we're returning this. Now we want to be able to utilize that. So this is the function that does it, but we're not utilizing this function yet. So up here in the index, we're going to call that. And we're going to call it ID lists, ID list. And we're going to use that. That list is going to get populated by our function here. Right, so we're going to call this getID lists function here. It's going to build a list of, it's going to create an empty list of items, and even more specific, an empty list of select list item. That's what this data type is here. It's going to add 4 items and it's going to return it. So when this finishes, this getID lists is going to populate this view data ID list. So let's take a look. I've added a breakpoint to this item, and I'm going to execute it. So just make sure that in your properties that you do have profile index set in the web tab and specific page. I'm going to close that. I've got a breakpoint set here, so let's go ahead and run it. So now my breakpoint's activated. So I'm going to step into this getID lists method. So you can do F11 on your keyboard, or you can click this button up at the top on the menu. Step into, and you can see now I'm in this. And I'm going to execute this first item. So if you look down in the locals or the autos, and if those don't show, you can go to Debug, Windows, and locals or autos to get them to be down here. If you open the items, you'll see that it's got a value of null. So it's not any kind of individual or specific item. So let's execute that. And now you'll see that it is an object and it does have a list. The list happens to be empty, has no individual items. So I'm just hitting F10 or doing step over. So now we just added the phrase select with a value of nothing. We'll open these items, show item 0, which is the first one, the phrase select, and the value of nothing. Just doing F10 one at a time. So now we got a count of 2, so we just added a second item in there, item 0 and item 1. So the second item, which is item 1, has this text and this value. And I'm going to do the next 2. So now we've got count of 4. So we've got 4 items here that we've added. And if you look at that, it's items 0 through 3, and each one of them have what we're expecting to put in them. And this is just a way of debugging and going in and validating that your code is building the things properly. So if now we just continue to F10, which is step over. So now this get ID lists populated this view data ID list object that we're going to be able to use over in the view. So I'm going to go ahead and hit continue, and we're going to check that out. All right, so now we have a drop list item, a drop list that's got select 1, 2, and 3. If you right click and go to view page source, you'll see here that it did indeed create a select, an HTML select item. We've given it the ID of LST IDs, and the first one has a value of nothing and the phrase select, right, just like we expected. Then the next 3 have a little bit of the same. We've got a phrase and we've got a value, right? And they all correspond to what we expected. So now we're just validating this is building what I expected it to build. So go ahead and close that view source. All right, so close this browser, come back into our code. So now we have an index view that's using a begin form, so that that should give you a clue that says we need to put something into our controller to handle this submit or this post, right? So let's go back to the profile controller. We're going to copy, take the breakpoint off. We're going to copy this action result, and then we're going to change and paste it and change it into an HTTP post action result. All right. So first we start there. And add the HTTP post attribute. Now this is complaining, saying this is exactly the same as this one. And of course it can't be. And inside, because we're doing a post, we need the form collection object, if you remember that from the previous assignment. And we're going to use the same name, same variable name, call. We're going to get rid of some stuff here that we don't need from that other one. All right, so now we're going to grab the drop list item that was selected. So I'm just creating a string variable, strid, and we're going to use the form collection object call, and we're going to use that property name, so the select list ID that we created, and then just turn it into a string. And we're going to put it into strid. So now we've got to evaluate that. We've got to evaluate this to see if they actually selected an item. So this should look somewhat similar. So we're making sure that select list, so that variable that we've got from our select list item is populated with something. So we got to make sure they selected something. If you remember, the first item is an empty value. So we don't want them to select that one. So we're saying make sure that this is not an empty string. And we want to make sure the button they pressed is the set button, the button that has the value of set. So if you look back here, here's our button. And then we have in the value property set for set ID. You can put it in, you can name it anything you want or give it a value of anything you want. It just has to make sense back in your code. So this is the view, and this is now back to the controller. So we're looking to say, did they hit that button? And I'm going to put a few things in here. We're going to add some empty space. So this, I'm just adding some comments to my code. Right, so now we've got that. So now we know that they picked an ID because it's not blank, and the button they pressed was the set button. In this case, there's only one button on the view, but you won't always have just one button on your view. Okay, so if that happens, what do we want to do? We're gonna use the redirect to action method, but we're going to add this ID to the query string, to the URL of your page. So we do that by redirect to action. We're going to go to that properties view. And that's not all. We also want to pass in the ID that they selected. So the syntax for that is new, and open close brackets. And we're setting the ID. So when we do a redirect to action, there's three parts. If you remember, there's three parts of the URL in MVC. The first part is the controller name. The second part, and that's the default view. If you don't include the controller in your redirect to action, then it's implying that you're going to this same controller. And in this case, it's a profile controller. So the redirect action is going to say go to the properties view and pass in the ID of the one they picked here. So the URL is going to look something like this. So it's going to be profile properties 2 or profile properties 1, whatever they happen to pick. And in this case, we had 1 through 3. So we'll just say 1 in this. So that's the way the URL is going to look. And it's going to return redirect to action and go to that view and pass in our item. Let's clean this up a little bit. Now, if either one of these, if both of these aren't executed, so if the STRID is an empty string, or it's not, the button they press is not set, then this won't work. It won't get into this if statement to do the redirect to action to that properties view. So if either one of these returns a bad value, we still have to populate our drop list, because now we're just going to show we're going to show the exact same view to the user. So that's why these two lines of code look exactly the same as these two lines of code. Okay, so before we execute anything, we're going to go ahead. So I'm going to copy this section of code here because we're going to make a new view. So I'm copying the index action result. And down below, I usually put my methods at the bottom of these, at the bottom of the controllers. So I just put a few lines, empty lines in between the index, the post index action result, and then the get ID list functions. I copied this part, and I'm going to paste it in here. We're going to create a new properties view. So we're going to rename that properties. I'm going to get rid of this, and it's going to be an empty view for now. We're going to populate it with more things here in a little bit, tidying up the code. and then right click in order to, so we have the action result inside our controller. We have our action result method, but we don't have the view yet. If you look over in the Solution Explorer under Profile, there's no Properties view yet. So now we're going to create that. Right click on Properties, Add View, click Add. Same thing as typical, and the H2 tag. Okay, we're going to save everything, X out of that. So now we're back to our controller. We're going to take the breakpoint off of this. We're going to add a breakpoint. Oh, sorry, we do want this breakpoint to remain. I'm going to put it up on the ID line of code. I'm also going to put a breakpoint here inside the properties. Okay, so go ahead and execute that. Okay, so we know that this is going to do a post because we have these two items inside our form, our HTML form. So if I right click here, go to View Page Source, you can see our form, right? This is our form, HTML form object. And when we click this button, it's going to do a post, and it's going to post to Profile Index. Okay, so we're going to select something. In this case, I'll select the second one and click Set ID. So now we're in the index, right? We're on the index post method, and we're using the form collection object call. I'm going to go to a step over, and now you'll see down in the autos or the local, both of them will show it, that this strid has a value of 2, right? Because that's what we got out of this. So now we're looking to make sure that this is not empty string and to see if the button they pressed is the select button. There's a couple ways you can do that. I'm just copying this line of code or this bit of code here, and I'm going to the immediate window, question mark, paste, and we'll see what this button submit has. So it's the value of set. And again, back in the view, this value set is here, so we're able to tell which button was pressed. So back to the controller. Okay, so if we step over the code, one line, it did indeed jump into this section. So now it's going to go to the properties view. And again, redirect action. If it doesn't show the controller, it's implying that it's going to this same controller that it's in right now. So we're going to the properties view, and we're going to pass in this strid, and we selected the second one. So I have a breakpoint now in the get properties action result. I've got a breakpoint now. So I'm just going to hit continue. So now that you see that we've jumped in, we hit our breakpoint. So we're in the view for properties. There's nothing, there's basically nothing in that properties view right now, but we are going to see that it does go to it. So hit continue. We'll see our browser and check it out. So we went to the profile controller, the properties view, and we passed in the value of 2, the second ID. All right, so close this tab. It'll stop it from running. Now we're going to go into, we're going to mimic, since we don't have a database yet in this project, we're going to mimic connecting to a database. So we're going to go to the models, right click on models, add class, and we're going to name this class database, click add. Okay, so again, we've got an empty database class. So we're going to create a function that returns a user object. We're going to call it GetUser, and we're going to pass in an ID. So that's the general structure of this method so far. You'll see this all the time because we haven't returned anything yet. So it's telling us, hey, this code is incomplete. So let's put a few lines in there. We're going to create a user object, and that completes at least enough of this function that it doesn't generate an error yet. So we're going to add some code. So this typically would connect to a database, then call some stored procedure inside that database to bring back the rest of the user based on that ID. So in this case, we're going to put in a switch statement that mimics connecting to the database. So the beginning of the switch. Break. So if they pass in 1, the ID 1, we're going to populate part of this user object with the properties for user 1. So first, we'll start with this. You want to add this to your code. So first name is Jane Doe with the user ID and password. Now we're going to populate a cell phone, right? So in the U, right, this object that we created, u.cellphone equals a new phone number. And we have to do this or cell phone would be null, because in our user class, cell phone starts out with null, just like all of these objects. This is typically what you'll see in your classes as you create them. So since we define all of these as null when this is first created, we have to be able to instantiate it and be able to use this cell phone object, and this is how we do that. So now we've got an empty cell phone object, and we're going to add a few properties to it. We're going to populate it with just some phone number, right? So this would read from a database and then populate these objects, but right now we're doing what's called hard coding it just to mimic the database call. So let's create an address. So u.address is new address, right? Without doing this new, this address object is null. Again, back in the user class, this object is null. So we can't just start using properties without giving it an object, instantiating the object. So that's what this does. So now I have an empty address, and then you can populate a few properties for that. So in this case, I'm giving the home address these properties, right? Okay, so now let's add a few more. Let's move this break over a little bit. Let's add a couple more cases. Case 2. Case 3. And then we're going to add the default. So all of these have to say, and a switch statement in C#, you have to break once you execute one. Unless you want every one of these to execute, you have to have a break after it. So basically, we say if this ID is 1, then do all this stuff, but don't evaluate the other ID 2, ID 3, anything else. Just jump out. So this is the general structure. So inside case 2, I'm pasting in all of these properties. So we're saying, what are we doing here? We're pretending, we're mimicking a database call. And then in the database for ID 2 is all of this information for Chris Jackson. For ID 1, we have this information for Jane Doe. And we're going to do a similar thing for ID 3 as well. So for ID 3, it's going to be Teddy Roosevelt. All right, so let's look at each one of these individually. So ID 1 is Jane Doe. Jane Doe has a cell phone number in this case, so we have to use the new phone number in order to give this an object, since cell phone is null to begin with in your class. and then we're just populating each one of the properties, right? Area code, prefix and suffix. This address, I'll go ahead and tidy this up a little bit. This address, because address is null in the class, we've got to say give me a new address and then give some properties. And then we're finished. We want to break out of this switch to say we don't want to do any other work. Without this break, it would then go into case 2. We don't want that, right? But if it comes in as case 2, we want to populate for Chris Jackson. Same thing with the cell phone. In this case, we're giving Chris 2 phone numbers, a cell phone and a work phone. Same thing with the address. We're giving it 2 addresses, home address and work address. And then we're breaking out. We're stopping and not evaluating any more cases. So if it comes into case 3, Teddy Roosevelt with a phone number and a home address. Okay, so save all. Let's go to the profile controller. So now we're going to execute and execute this method to return data for a user. So in the profile controller, I'm going to put a little bit of line. So if we're going to use the database class, we've got to create a database object. So models.database db as my variable name for database equals new database. So this is instantiating a new object, type db. We're also going to get a new user object. Models.user, u for the variable name, equals new user. And we need to get the ID that's going to be passed. So inside this index, it's calling the properties view and passing the ID that the user selected. So now we got to go and grab that ID. And it's going to look a little bit like this. If route data values, ID, so we're getting the ID part of this, doesn't equal null, that means it's been passed in. So now we're going to grab that value. So we're creating a string object, strid, and we're getting it. So this route value ID, we're casting it to a string and putting it into this property, or this variable, sorry. So then we call that database object, right? And we call that GetUser method, and we're passing in the ID. So since this is a string, we've got to cast this to be an integer, because the GetUser, if you look inside the structure, the GetUser is expecting a long, which is N16 is just a smaller version of a long. And then we're going to return the U object. So let's tidy this up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to take the breakpoint off up here. If you still have this breakpoint on here, take it off. I'm going to set a new breakpoint here. So I'm going to put a breakpoint back on the index post. So just before we do a redirect action to the properties view, we're going to put a breakpoint on it, and then we're going to evaluate to see what the ID is, and then we're going to continue to let it redirect to this view, and then we've got a breakpoint inside the properties to be able to catch it. So let's go ahead and run this. And I'm going to pick ID 3. Click the button. So it did the post, right? It got an ID, and you'll see that it's 3. So now it's going to redirect to action, which is going to redirect to the properties view, passing in this ID. So just continue. So you see it jumped into our next breakpoint. And now we're going to just step over. So we've got, if you look down inside, you look down inside the autos, the user object is an empty user object, but it's not null. If you go to locals, you'll be able to see the database object. Same thing, it's not null, there's just no properties set. So if we copy route data and go to the immediate window, question mark, paste, it shows you the value of route data, which is 3. That's the ID we selected, right? So this if statement is going to say as long as it's not null, and we just checked that it's not null, do an F10 to go inside this. It grabs that data, right? So now we've got that ID is populated. We're going to pass that into this str ID is 3. We're going to pass it into the db.getUser method, which populates and returns an object. So let's step into that. And it's evaluating this case. It's 3, so it's not going to jump into case 1. It won't jump into case 2. It will jump into case 3. So I'm going to continue. There it is. Just continuing one at a time. And you can see this U object is getting populated, right? The cell phone is null. A lot of these properties are just empty until we actually, so we've done Teddy Roosevelt and the user ID. So first name Teddy, last name Roosevelt, and the user ID. So those properties are set so far. As soon as I execute this line, it's going to populate the password. There it is. You can see that cell phone is an existing item, but it's null. So the first thing we've got to do is make that cell phone, instead of null, we got to make it a new phone number object. So you saw it change down here, and then you can open it up. All the properties are blank, but it is an object. Okay, so now we can set the area code. Right, you see it set here. Same thing with the prefix and then the suffix. A little more of the same. Home address is null. U.home address is null. We can validate that here as well. So now we're going to give it a home address, and a blank one, but it's instantiated. So now you see home address is no longer null, but it's got all empty values, but it's not null. So we're going to continue to step. That's our last property we're going to set. We're breaking out of the switch statement. And now we're going to return that U object. And keep in mind, this is a model.user object, and we're returning that, and this matches it. The signature, the function signature is it's public, so anything can call this. And this GetUser, when it's called, passes in an ID, and it returns a user object. Okay, so now we're just going to continue out of this method. So we're still sitting on this breakpoint here at the return. So I'm stepping. So now we can look inside local. Again, inside locals or autos. We can look and see what's in this user object. So I'm going to open this up a little bit. We've got a cell phone. We don't have an emergency phone, right? We don't have a home address to, or at least we're just not using this. These are properties of this class that you don't always use every property in your classes when you're doing object modeling and even using your websites and testing it. It's got some name, name, first name, last name, password, user ID. Some of these are just blank. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit. And we're getting ready to return that. So go ahead and continue. Now, it returned it to the properties view, but we're just not displaying any information. We're not utilizing the view yet. So I'm going to go back into, not that one, going back into the properties view. And this is all we're doing so far. We're not even we're not even using we're not adding the model to the top of this view yet. So that's what we'll do next. Okay, let's stop this from running. So to begin with, the first thing you have to do when you're wanting to take that model that we're using in our controller, but inside the action result for the view, in order to return that and use it, we've got to declare it on our view, the HTML of our view. So if I'm going back to the properties view, so at the top, we're saying our model is web2 blank models.user. So now we just told our view, here's your data, right? Here's what you can do with this view from a data perspective. So we're going to start out by adding some styles. And I prefer, I don't know if you just noticed, when you paste in styles, it reformats it. I don't like all this extra space. There's taking up too many lines just for this little bit. So when I paste in and then I do a Control Z, it undoes the formatting that Visual Studio put into it and leaves it to the way I pasted it in. So we've just got a couple classes that we're defining. I'll get into what these are in a few minutes. You should remember the sum spacing. It's just adding margin bottom to whatever div is there. And then we've got data submitted. So we'll see what that is here in a little bit. Okay, so let's first go ahead and put in a using statement. So using the HTML, the HTML.begin form. Okay, and remember, when you just use the begin form with no parameters, you're basically saying, I'm going to do a post to this controller, whatever controller I'm in, and this view, whatever view I'm in. And of course, that's the profile properties. Let's add some buttons to the top of this. So a submit button and a home button, right? We'll give them some names, some IDs, and a couple values. You remember, because each time when we click these buttons, we've got to determine which one of these buttons are clicked. Okay, and we're just going to add one property for now. And we're going to add the first name. All right, so we have a model added to our properties, right? MVC, M is the model part of MVC. So we're using a model. We've got a little CSS styles, right? Using a begin form because we're going to submit in a little bit. So in order to submit data, you got to wrap it in a begin form. Two buttons and a couple of divs, and we're utilizing only the model.firstName right now. Now this part, you can see something we've added here. This is something new. This is going to set the autofocus. It's basically going to set the focus to the first item, or to the first name inside this view. So let's check that out. I'm going to put a breakpoint back in our controller. Not here, but I'm still going to put it here so we can see this, that the database is getting populated. I'll pick a different ID. And remember, again, the only way this works is because we have the drop list and the button inside the begin form tag. So when I click this, I know to do something with it. So I'm going to pick one. It's doing a post, right? It did this post and then jumped in and did this redirect to action, which is basically to go to another view. And it looks similar to this. So profile, properties, and whatever the ID I picked. So we can see here, hover over it, strid1 is 1, sorry, strid has a value of 1. And now that user object is populated. But back on my view, the only thing we're going to see is first name because that's the only thing I've added to the view. So go ahead and continue. And you can see that Jane, that first name is populated into this input text box. And you also see that the cursor is put in there. That cursor is put in there by that autofocus property, by this part here, right? So if I right click, go to view page source, you can see where the label was created, right? And the first name input box, and you see this autofocus was added to it, right? We were able to do that, and this is how you add that. So this label, HTML label 4, it's kind of strange syntax, but it's saying the model is model.firstName, the model property. We're setting it to model.firstName. Same thing with the text box 4. We're saying this text box is for model.firstName. And in this case, this label is for model.firstName. And then we're just setting the autofocus property, and that automatically puts the cursor in that first name. Okay, so we're going to stop this from running. And the meat of this is set up. All we have to do is just add more fields, more model objects onto this page. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to add the last name, user ID, and password, right? So basically more of the same syntax here, except we're using last name. Same here, except we're using the user ID. And the same here, and we're using a password. Now, what this is a little different, it uses the same type of structure here, setting the autofocus, but in this case, we're setting the type to be password. And what that does is, depending on your browser, it'll either do asterisks or bullets to show you that password is populated, but that we have to hide it. So I'm going to go ahead and just run this, and we'll look at those new fields and check out the password field, see how it looks. I'll pick a different ID, number 2. I'm going to go ahead and take this breakpoint off. There you go. So we've got the first name, the last name, and the password. Sorry, user ID and a password. Now, the reason we use the label 4 is because as I click on this label, say I'm going to click on the user ID label, it's associated with this text box. View source, you see this, I'll do last name. So last name, and inside the label, there's a for property. And it's saying this label is for the last name text box. Close that. So when I click on last name, it's actually going to put the cursor inside that text box, right? If we didn't do the for, then it wouldn't put the focus there. You'll also notice that the password, you can't see what it is. That's because right-click, view source, that we have the type set, right? It's just HTML type equals password. So that tells the browser to mask it, not to just show it so just anybody can see it. And then I think I already said this. So this is the autofocus for the first name. So it's putting the focus in the first box on that field. Sorry, first box on that view. Okay, close this out. We'll stop it from running. Let's go back to the properties view. So now we're going to add more of these fields. We're going to add more of our model to our HTML view. And this time we're going to do a home address. Okay, so I just pasted this in, right? So now we're looking for, this is using a little different technique than the others. We blindly show what's in first name, last name, user ID, and password. We just say if it's empty, show it. If it's got data in it, show it. But now we're going to do something different. We're going to say I'm only going to show this HTML if the model has a home address. Otherwise, these won't end up going down to the user. So the first thing I do is model.homeAddress. If it does not equal null, then home address, although it could have all empty fields, it's not null. So then we can go ahead and display it. So I'm going to save that, go ahead and run. And now I'll have to remember which one of those had a home address. I'll just try 3 to start. Okay, so 3 must have a home address because these fields are populated. Let's go back in and see. I think I might have done a home address for all of them. That is, and then finally 2. Yeah, there's a home address for everything. So this is just more of the same. See how if I click on the label itself, because it's associating the 4 and address 2, it's associating the click of the label with the text box, right? Because there's no worth of clicking the label and not setting the property. So this is just the HTML helping us out. It's just HTML doing its job. Now, address 2 happens to have no data in it, so that's just blank. City, state, zip. Okay, let's add home address 2. Now, what I will tell you for this home address 1, and this is how I do it all the time, don't retype this next section, right? Don't retype it. Copy this, right? Because you know it's going to be very close to this. So copy this, put some space in the middle, and paste, but we're not looking for home address. We're looking for home to address. So just change this to 2. And again, the reason for pasting is you get away from human error, just mistyping, bad keystrokes. It'll save you a lot of time in the long run to get used to copy and pasting. So change that to 2, double click on it, Control C for copy. Everywhere you see home address, you just paste. And now I don't have to worry about having any errors in my code because I looked and saw that this was all just right. All I needed to change, I copied that section for home address, pasted in here for home to address, and then just changed the important fields. Now you have to be careful. Copy and pasting is a very risky and dangerous thing. You just have to get good about it. So I'm going to tidy up a little bit. Now, only the ones that have a home to address will show this. So let me go into the database, see if anything has a home to address. So it doesn't. So I'm going to create a, inside the database class, under case 2, I'm going to add a home to address. So I copied, same thing, I copied home address because I know that's working. And I pasted it underneath. As long as you paste it in a logical spot, it doesn't matter if it's before or after. And again, change that. I'm going to call this 3 Main Street. Columbus, Ohio. I don't know Columbus's zip. So we'll just leave it at that. So now for ID number 2, I added a home to address so I can see that second address in my view. So I'm going to go back to the properties. And the properties are saying if home to address is not null, then go ahead and show the home to fields. So let's take a look at that. So only ID 2 has a home to address. Okay, select ID 2. And there we go. Here's our second address. So address this, that's all home address 2, home to address, and this is home address. Now, I can say I don't really care that you can't tell between address 1 and this 2 address 1s. It looks like it's duplicate data. So we're going to add just a little bit of HTML into this. So up here for home address, we're going to add that there. And we're going to add that here as well, home to address, so we see it. Let's go take a look at that. Now this is just HTML and making things a little less confusing on your web pages, views and MVC. So I'm going to set ID 2, and now I've got home address, home to address. Check it out, right? Now if I pick something else, I'm not going to see a home to address because it doesn't populate it in the model, just home address, right? Okay, let's go and check out the other. So now this should be obvious to you. We're going to put in the work address, right? Home, that work address, change the header. Let's just do and copy and paste, right? I'm just double clicking and pasting. Embrace copy and paste. Save you decades of your career. Okay, so now let's go back into our view, and I'm just going to refresh this because I have the HTML now, and I don't have anything new there. I can't remember which one had a work address. Maybe 3. Nope. 1. Nope. 2. There it is. Okay, let's go ahead and stop this from running. And now we're going to add the last couple of fields. So outside of the if statement for the work address, can be careful with C#. It's easy to get these curly braces mixed up. You want to be outside of it, right? And we're going to add cell phone. Now, this is a little different because this field, we're really, the 4 would be for the area code, but we don't want to necessarily say the area code here because of the way we're formatting it. So instead of using an HTML or an HTML label 4, we're just putting a label in and we're manually creating the 4. So when they click on this label, it goes to the first item. So let me let you take a look at this, and then I'll come back and show you more about this, how we're setting up the phone numbers. I'm going to pick 1. All right, so our phone numbers, we're going to break into individual pieces, right? Instead of having one box to put the phone numbers in, and this is pretty standard. You'll notice when I click on zip, it goes there. Same thing here, cell phone. It goes right in the first one because the label 4 for this cell phone is cell phone dot area code, which is this, right? So we're making 3 text boxes on the same line. I'm just putting a little bit of a little label inside each one, right, to make it look formatted properly. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to the code. We'll leave it running. Let's go back to our code. So what this looks like, I'm gonna break this down and then we'll put it back together. All right, so these are the 3 pieces, right? We've got a div, and all 3 of these are going to be inside this one div. So I'm putting a parenthesis around whatever this is. So this is it. This is going to be a text box, but I'm putting parentheses around it to sort of help inform the user that that's the area code, right? That's how phones are usually presented on web pages. So I've got the model.cellphone.area code. Right? Model.cellphone.prefix, model.cellphone.suffix. Now the class, the CSS class I'm adding is phone area code, phone suffix, phone prefix, phone suffix. Scroll to the top and you'll see all of this. So we're making the area code 2.5 ems wide because that's about the width of 3 characters in an area code. Same thing for prefix. Suffix is a little bigger, so I'm making it 3 ems. Okay, so these are just saying how wide do I want these fields, and then I go down and look, and I'm for the area code, I'm using the area code CSS name, prefix, suffix, phone suffix. So now these are just making the text box a particular width based on the style, based on the the style class that I'm using. So I'm going to bring all of this back up into one line. Now what you have to make sure is you got to leave a space here, because we want there to be a space in between each one of these fields. We don't want them to be jammed straight up on top of each other. And the same thing here, I've got a space and then the hyphen and then another space. And I'm just hitting the delete key and bringing these back up into the same row. Okay, and now I want to bring up that div. So go at the end of here. So now I just brought all this back up. So this div should now look like it did before I started separating them on different lines. We've got the area code with 2 characters, the parentheses on each side, right? And then a space before we get to the prefix. And the prefix has just the prefix. We have a space, a hyphen, and another space. And then we're displaying the suffix. All right, so now we're going to copy that and paste it for the home phone. So that's home phone area code. So I'm going to copy and pasting. So I'm changing where it used to say cell phone. I copy and pasted, but I want it to be home phone. And everything else is the same. That should say home, right? So here's the label for it. And here are the 3 individual text box 4s for each one of those. Home area code, home prefix, and home suffix. So I'm going to copy that again and add the work phone. All right, so let's go ahead and move the work phone below cell phone. Grab this, just drag it up in front of, after cell phone. So we want cell phone, work phone, home phone, and we have one more phone. And that's emergency phone. So copy and paste. And even if it doesn't feel completely natural, force yourself to copy and paste. You'll be a better software developer because of that. Okay, so all these are identical from a CSS and HTML standpoint. We just have a couple pieces. So the label 4 are different for each one, right? They've got to be for the right area code, because we want that to jump in the first text box of that section. We're giving it a label, right, for each one of these. Skip that one and that one. We're making sure we change the object cell phone, and then when we copy and paste it for work phone, we got to change it home phone and emergency phone, and you have to do that for all 3 of these: area code, prefix, and suffix. So go ahead and save. Go back to your browser and F5, and now we have all 4. Okay, we're about finished with what we're doing with this project. So let's go ahead and stop it from running. So now, all the way at the top of the properties view, close to the top, we're going to add one of these view data sections. So right underneath the P tag, we're going to add this. We're going to define a view data submitted, okay, and that value we're going to put in a true or false. So if this data submitted is not null and it's true, then we want to show this little div. And you see it on social media, you see it on websites all the time. When you click something, normally it shows you some kind of message saying that action was successful. So what we're going to do is show data submitted successfully, right? Nothing, no rocket science here. So we've got to be able to we've got to be able to now populate this view data submitted with some kind of value when the user hits the submit button or the save button. So let's go ahead and go back into the profile controller. And we're going to go to we got to create a properties submit action result. So I'm going to copy properties, paste it, change the attribute, HTTP post, same thing, form collection as a property, COL. Okay, we're going to clear out most of this code. All we want to keep is the model variable and then the return. So the first thing we're going to look at is if the user submitted the home button, then we're just going to go to the current controller index. And in this case, it's going to go to profile index. So if the user hits the home button, just go to profile index. That should be easy enough to validate. So this is on the properties page, on the properties view. Okay, pick an ID. If we get a home, it goes back to profile index. Stop it from running. Let's go ahead and add some more code. Move this over a little bit. So now we're going to see if they hit the submit button, right? So when they hit the submit button, the first thing we want to know about is what's the ID. Because typically when you have a submit button on a page and you have text boxes or input boxes with text in it, normally what you're doing is you're saving that. So you need to know what you're saving it to, and this ID has the ID of that. So 1, 2, or 3. So we've got to get that value first. Now, when we submit, this user object is not populated, right? This is a brand new empty object at this point. So now we've got to repopulate it with everything from this form collection object back into this user object. So we populated the form object here, and we showed the view. Once the user posts back, this is not populated. It's empty. So we want to be able to go in and populate it. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to first start with first name, last name, user ID, and password, right? All of them using the same syntax that we've used before. Now we're going to go ahead and grab home address, but we're only going to grab home address if it doesn't equal null, right? So if there is a home address, then we want to show it. If you remember, not every one of these had all the same fields, so some of them are blank. So this is just saying populate home, the u.home address is null. So you always have to do this. You always have to do new. That gives it an empty home address. And then you can put fields into it, put properties into it. We're going to do the same thing with work address. Mind your curly braces. Make sure you're outside of this if. If you try to paste it inside that if, things aren't going to work out as well. Okay, so now we've got work address, right? Same thing. We've got to instantiate work address. So this gives it an object, an empty one. And then from the call, the form collection object, the call, here, now we're grabbing the fields that user inputted. Home address 2. And the order of these isn't necessarily that important. most times. Okay, so home address 2, same thing. It's a null when it comes here. We've got to get it instantiated, give it an empty object, and then we just populate it. Those are the 3 addresses. Now we've got to do cell phone. Right? This all should look very similar. Now you'll want to pause this video and take a look at these and make sure all this makes sense. But it's more of the same. It's nothing new that you're looking at now. So I'm going to go ahead and grab all the rest of these phone number fields or code and populate it, right? So make one of these and then copy and paste it for the next ones and just add the different properties. Be sure that you're changing these as well, right? So this has to match up with this and so forth. Same thing with emergency phone. Now, so the last piece to all of this is if the button's pressed, right? If they hit submit, then we're going to take all the data from the collection. We're going to get a new user object. We're going to put all that data into this user object. Eventually, we're going to return that user object back to the view because it's then going to repopulate those text box fields. And then the last piece, we're going to set that data submitted view data item. We're going to set it to be true. So this is going to be null until we set it to true, and then we're going to be checking for that inside our view. So now the user hit a submit or hit a save. We took all this code, and it's a lot of code, but there's nothing special about it. There's nothing difficult. Just pause the video, take a look at this, and make sure it makes sense. But this is just more of the same that we've already covered. So we'll save all this data, all these data points, and then the data submitted view data we're going to set to true. And if we go back to the properties view, remember this, we added this because we want to show a message to the user. Now, one thing I haven't talked about much yet is I've also added a CSS item, right? So data submitted. So around this data submitted successfully, we're going to have a padding on the inside of 1em. So top right, bottom left padding of 1em. It's going to have a 1 pixel solid black border. And then the background is going to be light green. And you'll see this data submitted that we're adding this to the class here for that div. So below it gets some spacing, right? It gets a 1em of spacing below it. But then we're also applying all these other properties of this class. And in CSS, the more classes you want to add to it, you can continue to add. You just have to define those. So it's all just separated by a space. All right, let's run this and take a look. I'm going to set a breakpoint back in the profile controller. I'm going to set a breakpoint on this action result submit right at the top. Okay, back to my view. I'm going to pick ID2, go. Now, there's no breakpoint because I set the breakpoint when I hit submit. All right, so I'm going to change a couple of these fields just so you know that even though it says Chris Jackson, C Jackson on the get, when I post it, we want to make sure that if I happen to say, nope, my name is Christopher, and it's Johnson. Okay, so now when I submit this, these fields are going to be Christopher Johnson, CJ Johnson, because it's different than what it was when I came in. Picture this, that you're going to your profile on social media and just changing your name, right? It has your previous name before. Once you submit it, then it has your new name. So I'm going to click submit. Okay, so it's jumping into the HTTP post action result properties with the form collection populated. You can see 32 keys. These are all the different fields. that we have on that form. And this is just doing debugging. This is looking at this data, and you're going to come in and you're going to see some of these empty, and you're going to think, okay, I've done something wrong. So that's the point of checking out what your code is doing. You've got to debug. You've got to test. You got to make sure that everything is being populated like it should. All right, so I'm just doing a step over. So this user object, again, this is a brand new user object. It has no idea of the data that it had on the other view, on this view. So it doesn't know. Only the collection, the form collection, has that data. So now you can even look, this U object, everything is empty. We got nulls and we've got empty strings. So now we're looking to see if I hit the home button. Nope, or it would have jumped into this. So now we're going to see, did I hit the submit button? And it did. So it's jumping down into here. So the first thing we're doing is getting that ID. This says user ID. It's okay, but it really should have been ID. That's a better name for it. That would be staying consistent of what I did in the other sections. But as long as you understand what it is, it's a very minor thing. All right, so now we're looking at this call object and we're populating things. So check it out. First name is Christopher. It was Chris, right? So now we're getting the new name from the fields, and the way Visual Studio shows you in debugging, the most recent field updated is in red. So I'll do the next one, and we'll see last name will be updated, or it will be in yellow. Where is it? Right there. I'll just continue on. User ID, password. Now it shows it in clear text as for you in Visual Studio, but to the user, remembered we had that type password, so it just showed it in as bullets to hide the password. So now we're going to look, is there a home address? Yes. So if they didn't have a home address, it wouldn't jump into this section. And you'll see all these fields. Where's home address? Right there. Right? So zip isn't populated yet. Where is zip? Right there. So this will turn red as soon as I populate it. There you go. So more of the same. It's going to look at work address. Same thing, populate all the fields. Home to address. Looking at cell phone. Home phone. Work phone, emergency phone. And now we're going to set this view data submitted to true. This is going to let it show, if I go back to the properties.cs HTML, if this is not null and it's true, then we're going to show this little div. Okay, so let's get back to our controller. Now I'm just going to hit continue. And look at that, right? Data submitted successfully. Now that's not a very pretty label or pretty panel, but it does the trick for what we're looking to do now. So now if I hit home, we've already tested this, but if I hit home, it'll go back to the controller's index view. Right there. Run this. Okay, so now I just want to go through and just jump through some of these with no breakpoints. You'll see how the site flows. Right, even if I don't change anything, it still says data submitted successfully. Okay, that's everything for this lecture. I'll do a quick review. So we created a new profile controller. Inside that controller, we've got two views, an index and properties, right? Each of those views, all views don't always do a post, but often they do. So I've got a get, right? Remember this is HTTP get. If you don't put the attribute here, then it defaults to get. So both of these get properties could have these on in front of it. It's just not the typical practice. Most times we don't do that. We only do it for the post. There's other attributes as well, but we're just looking at get and post right now. So both of these views have a get and a post. Right inside the post, they have a form collection that's getting the items that the user submitted. In order to do a post, inside either one of the views, you've got to have a begin form, right? And all the elements that you're going to be looking at back in your controller have to be inside that begin form. So if I had this button outside here, I wouldn't be able to see the button press. It wouldn't be part of it. It wouldn't even do a post. Back to the controller. This is the ID the user selected. So we're for the drop list. They picked the drop list, and we added this drop list. The drop list ID, we added it to the top of the query string. So when you look at the URL, you're in Profile, Properties, and whatever ID that is. It's 1, 2, and 3 in our case. Then we're setting, then this just gets those drop list items we talked about before, and then it returns that view. For the properties, we need to know what item did they pick. So what ID did they set here? So that's what we're getting. We're making sure they picked some ID, right? If that route data.values ID is null, they didn't pick an ID. So here's the way you get that. You get that route data values ID .toString, and you put it to a variable. And then in order to send it, so right now this is a string, we got to cast it to a number, and I just picked int 16 here. And then we're passing that into the GetUser method in the database class. Now this really isn't it. We'll build out a database class later in this class, but right now this is only it's a fake database. It's just it only handles 3 IDs, and it populates hard codes just a few values, just so we can simulate how a database class might work, right? All 3 of those. And then this user object is populated, and then we return it back to the view, and then it displays all of those properties. I'll go to the views in just a minute. So in the post of the properties view, now we're looking if they hit the home button, just does a redirect, goes back to the profile index. If they hit the submit button, then they're meaning that we want to save it. In order to do that, we've got to get, using this call structure, we've got to get all the values that they put in, right? So this doesn't copy over or carry over. It doesn't carry over from the get, even though this is populated and it's fully populated right here. It's disconnected. It's completely disconnected when it goes to the browser, when it goes in a browser. So when you come back into a post, you have to go get all those items again, because now this is a new blank user object. And so this is how we grab those. We use that collection and then the name .toString that populates each one of these fields. Of course, this has to be if you had user ID, you would be putting user ID into the password field. Of course, that's not what we want. Mostly the same. We're just saying if they didn't have an address 1, don't go look for it. Otherwise, go get what the user typed in. Same thing for work address, home to address, and then we've got 4 phone numbers. So once we collect all that data, then we set this data submitted to true. It's just a 4-character value. It's not even an object. When it comes back to this properties, if that data submitted is not null and it equals true, then show that div.